It's nearly Valentine's Day, so I thought today it would be fun to draw a rose. I'll be drawing this with pastel pencils. I've linked in the description all of the materials I'll be using. So let's get started. I first off want to begin by showing you how to draw out the sketch. Now I find this easiest to start from the center of the rose and work my way out from there. So I'm beginning by just drawing the shape of the very dark patch in the center. And then I can start drawing the petals around that, but at least I've got the center as a kind of starting base point. Now the goal here is just to get the proportions right. I'm not trying to put in any sort of shading. It's not supposed to look brilliant at this point. I literally just want to give myself a guide to work with. Once I've drawn the flower, I can then draw the stem and the leaves as well. Now, although I'm drawing this quite hard right now, I'm only doing that so that you can see what I'm doing. In actuality, for my sketch, I'm drawing this extremely lightly so it doesn't show through when I've finished the drawing. So now I've got my sketch, I want to begin thinking about adding some colour. Before we get started with that, if you'd like to draw this with me in real time, it is available on my Patreon, along with over 200 hours of other tutorials. I draw with a mixture of pastels as well as graphite and colour pencils, and every tutorial includes in-depth instructions, the reference photos, sketch outlines and swatches of all of the colours I'll be using. Check out the link in the description. Now let's add some colour. So what I want to do here is start with a mid-tone colour. I'm kind of looking for the colour that I can see the most prominently, and I want to begin here on the flower. So I'm selecting a quite dark red. There is a little bit of a brighter red in some of the highlights, but on the most part this rose is a dark red with shadows of very dark brown. And all I'm doing here is marking out the mid and dark tones. The lighter tones I am purposefully leaving right now. This is allowing me to put some sort of pencil down on the paper, but also mark everything out a little bit clearer. So I got my sketch to guide me. This is going to cover up that sketch, but I can use the pastel marks as my new guide. I am varying my pressure a little bit, so on some of the very dark areas I'm pressing a little bit harder, putting down a bit more pastel. And then the more mid-tone areas, I'm just putting a little bit less of the pastel down. On the most part, I'd say I'm using a medium pressure. I don't want to be pressing full force, but also I want to get a decent amount of the pastel down, so I do want to be pressing reasonably hard. From here, I want to use a brighter red, and I'm wanting to fill in some of these lighter colours. So a lot of the areas that I've left blank with the first colour, I'm now wanting to fill in with this colour. Now I can't stress enough at this point that you expect it to look a little bit weird at this point. You expect it to look very bumpy and textured and also a little bit weird. That's fine, it'll all come together a bit later. Now I'm putting this red in all of the lighter areas and any other areas that I want to brighten up, but I'm leaving the edges of the petals in the middle. These areas have more of a kind of purple tone to them, so I'm going to want to add in a purple here rather than putting the bright red. Now the purple that I've selected for this is actually quite a dark purple. It's a kind of purplish red, but I would say it's the right colour even if it's the wrong shade, and I can always brighten it up with the white pencil. So I'm just going to put a covering of that over the centre, and then I can start thinking about marking in some of the darker shadows. So in between each of the petals there is a very deep shading. So I want to be adding this in with my darkest brown in the set. I'm not necessarily trying to be completely perfect with this. I'm really just trying to get a rough template that I can work from. So I'm just following the reference, and anywhere where it does look particularly dark, I'm putting a little bit of this colour. I am slightly varying my pressure where the darker shadows blend into the lighter areas, but just a little bit so it's not so harsh. I can then use a reddish brown to smooth out the edges of these areas to the edge of the very dark pastel and get it to blend a little bit better into the very dark red. And then I just want to use the white to lighten up this purple in the center. And then at this point, I'm happy with my base layers. I want to think about blending this all together and pushing that pastel into the paper. Now all I'm using here is a Q-tip, and I want to be working in little circular motions, just pressing quite lightly. I'm not pressing hard. And it's just, as you can see, smoothing all of this out. Now I can still see some of the texture of the paper, but that's fine. We can build up more pastel on that to reduce it. The most important thing I'm doing here is generally working from the lighter areas towards the darker areas. If I start off blending the darker areas into the light, it's just going to end up looking really muddy. So if I blend a darker area, I want to use a different part of my cotton bud so I don't end up making my light areas too dark. So by the time I've blended this, I have a quite messy rose, but it is a good template that I can build other colours off of. Because it's all been blended together, a lot of the darker areas have lost their depth. They're looking much lighter than I want them. So I'm going to start again with that same very dark brown and just deepen down those areas once again. But this is exactly the same as I did to start with. And I'm basically going to work through a lot of the same colours again, but refining everything. So I can go back to the dark red that I used at the very beginning. And on a lot of these lighter edges of the petals, there's some extra shading where it's not all one colour. There's some areas that are darker than others. So I want to start marking in those darker areas. And I can then move on to a lighter red pencil and brighten up some of the lighter parts of the petal. Now you'll notice that it's still looking very grainy at the moment, and that's fine. It'll look much better when I've given this another blend. So what I'm doing at this point is looking at my drawing against the reference and trying to work out what colour I think is missing. So for example, around here, some areas of the rose are brighter red. So I want to go back to that very vibrant red and just add in a little bit on some of the edges of the petals. And then I can go back to that reddish brown and just add in a bit more of some of the darker midtones. I'm going to deepen down some of the darker tones one more time, and then I once again want to give this a blend. So this time I'm not using a cotton bud, I'm going to use a blending tool. These are very, very good at pushing the pastel into the paper and smoothing it all out, but you also get a lot of control on where that pastel is going. So it's kind of a rubbery tipped paintbrush. So I'm once again working in circular motions, and I am still blending from the lighter colours to the darker colours. Where I've blended a darker colour and I need to clean my blending tool, I can just wipe it on a tissue and then I can go back to a lighter area. And I basically want to blend one section at a time. So I'm blending the edges of the petals where it's a bit lighter, and then I'm also separately blending the darker areas in between these petals, wiping off my blending tool in between. And by the time I've done this, it is looking like a rose. It's looking very dark at this point, but don't worry about that. We can lighten it up a bit later. So I'm going to come back to the flower in a minute. I want to focus on drawing the leaves. And I once again want to approach this in a similar way to what I did with the flower. So I want to begin by mapping everything out and putting down some base layers. So I'm starting off with a very light green and putting this down anywhere where I can see this colour. Some of the leaves are quite a bright green and some of them are more of a bluish green, depending on if it's the front or back of the leaf. So I do need to use a couple of different greens for this. But I'm really just working through a few different greens and generally marking everything out. At this point, I'm not worrying about any sort of details. I can also use the same very dark brown that I used before for all of the particularly dark areas. Where possible, I do try and use the same colours in the various different areas of a drawing. I find it helps to tie it all together. So I would try and avoid using a different dark brown for the leaves. Now, because this particular rose is slightly tilting forwards, I do want the leaves and stem to look a little bit out of focus. So I am really thoroughly blending, particularly around the edges, so that they do look a little bit less crisp in the outside lines. So now I've got something down on the whole of the rose. It becomes a bit easier to see where I need to add more shading. So I'm going to once again start off by focusing on the leaves and the stem. And I'm going to start darkening down some areas of the leaves, so using the same dark green that I used before. I can also use the same reddish brown I used for the flower. Just there's a few areas where the light of the flower is clearly reflecting on the leaves. So I just want to add a little bit of that same colour here. And then I can go back to that dark brown and really deepen down the values. As I say, because the leaves are a little bit out of focus, I don't need to worry about adding in too many details. I am looking for any odd variations in shading. So for example, on this very big leaf at the front, there's a few subtle kind of stripes of the leaves that I can still see. But on the most part, I don't need to worry too much about adding any fine detail down here. And then I once again want to give that a really thorough blend. So now the whole rose has been drawn, I can start looking at adding in all of these little tweaks that's going to give it an extra pop. So I want to start off by adding a actually much darker colour. I'm going to use a colour called dark sepia, which is like an extremely dark grey. And I'm going to use this on a little bit on the leaves, but I also want to be really deepening down the areas in between the petals. And you can see what a massive difference that makes. Because I'm doing some final tweaks, I am blending this with the blending tool after each pencil, and then I can see a bit clearer what I'm dealing with. I then on the flower want to focus on brightening up a lot of the edges of the petals. Now usually when I sharpen my pastel pencils, I do this with a craft knife. I just scrape away the edges of the pencil and that gives me a decent amount of the pastel to work with. Now I have here, because I'm wanting to be really precise with where the pastel's going and I want it to come in really bright, I've sharpened it this time with my pencil sharpener. And that's what's given me this very good point. Now the main reason why I don't usually do this is because I do find it makes my pencil sharpener very blunt very fast. But I don't think it's going to make a massive impact just doing one pencil. So I'm going to work my way around the edges of the leaves, anywhere where I think it could do with a little bit of brightening up. And then on the centre of the rose, where I said before it has a little bit of a purple tone, I'm just going to very lightly add some purple over the top of this. And then the last thing I need to do is just tidy up around the edges with a putty eraser. And that is it. Alright, and that's it. Don't forget the full video is available on my Patreon. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Don't forget to click the subscribe and the notify bell so you never miss an art tutorial. Happy drawing, guys. I'll see you in the next one.